There were potentially several factors at work here. One was the perception on the part of some party leaders, perhaps in particular Zhou Enlai, the premier, that the Hufeng campaign had gone too far. And in their opinion, it was perhaps now time to heal wounds and for the party and experts and intellectuals to work together to build this new socialist China. According to an official estimate after the Hufeng campaign, and this is a generous estimate, so that's why it was official, I suppose, 40% of intellectuals supported the regime more or less actively, 40% of them supported it without taking any active part, 10% went along with it reluctantly, and 10% were openly hostile. This is hardly a scientific survey, and a figure of 10% shouldn't seem so bad, but the real problem was that large numbers of intellectuals appeared to be only partially active and were truly apathetic toward the regime. It was just at this time that the limits of the strict Soviet model of economic planning, of technocratic planning, were also becoming obvious, and the need for a greater participation by China's own trained experts seemed more and more important for continued economic development. In January 1956, at a central conference of the Chinese Communist Party on the question of intellectuals, Zhou Enlai expressed the belief that the time had come for cooperation between the party and intellectuals, time to come for the party to help develop technical skills and to increase, as was said, the political awareness of this trained elite. To accomplish this, it was deemed important that the party allow for some greater self-expression, some greater self-confidence on the part of intellectuals. For artists, the phrase went, "Let 100 flowers bloom." And for scientists and technicians, the phrase was coined, "Let 100 schools of thought contend." This movement didn't get very far, however. Perhaps it was still too close to the Hufeng campaign, and perhaps more important, it was interrupted by significant events in the global communist world, outside of China, in the world communist movement. And these events had immediate relevance for the issues of party control and public expression that Zhou had been talking about. One outside shock came in February of 1956, and that was the secret speech in the Kremlin by the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, denouncing Stalin's practices and proposing to the worldwide communist movement a strategy of moderation in both domestic and foreign policies. This came as a surprise to communist leaders in China, who had, after all, grown up under Stalinism and who were, in their own ways, remarkable Stalinists. They had not been informed in advance, but even more surprising and more troubling was what seemed to be the chain reaction that followed in Eastern Europe following Khrushchev's speech in the summer and autumn of 1956. With the lessening of Stalinist controls, or apparent, riots broke out in Poland, in Poznan, in April. There was a liberalization of the Polish regime in the autumn, the so-called Polish October. And worst of all was the Hungarian crisis, which seemed to begin, at least from a Beijing perspective, with critical discussions among intellectuals. And it would end with the massive intervention of Soviet tanks sent to Hungary in part on the urging of the Chinese Communist Party. All of this was more than enough to give pause to thoughts of liberalization, and the leadership thus thought to maintain tight party control while slowly enlisting intellectual and expert participation in a scaled-down, cautious second five-year plan. The fact that a movement like the 100 Flowers movement occurred at this time, a movement calling for more openness, in some sense, from an outside perspective, from the perspective of international communism, may be the worst time for such a test, can probably be laid largely at the door of Mao Zedong. Other party leaders seemed much more cautious. The reaction of the party hierarchy to the both successes and limits, and at the end of the day, difficulties of the first five-year plan on a Soviet model, was essentially one of retrenchment, of scaling down industrial projects, of investing more capital in agriculture, and allowing for greater market freedoms in agriculture as a means of encouraging more production, production that would in turn be used, the surplus of such production, ideally, for industrial development.